Hello, I'm Lisa Kolb. I'm the Hazard Mitigation Section Chief at Vermont Emergency Management. During this presentation, you'll hear from Deputy Director Stephanie Smith as she discusses the Hazard Mitigation Program. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
I'll start by giving a quick overview of what hazard mitigation is. So hazard mitigation is really what we're talking about is reducing our vulnerability. We're talking about preventing long-term future risk where we can. So in the photos here, this is an example of a property buyout, which is one of the things that we fund the most in this program, where the home was damaged. We've demolished the structure. It's now gone. The site is maintained as green open space in perpetuity. The vulnerability is gone. Next time the river needs to come up and access its floodplain, it can do that and nothing bad will happen. So within the program, we have two sides, really. There's the planning side of my team and the grants side. So I'm going to focus most of today talking about our grant funding, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of the planning side as well. So Vermont Stronger is our state hazard mitigation plan. This is a document that we update every 5 years, so the most recent was from 2023, and really it puts forth a vision for a safer and a more resilient Vermont. So the plan goes through all of the hazards that we're vulnerable to in the state. Flooding has been the highest focus within that document, both inundation flooding and erosion flooding, but we're also talking about landslides, we're talking about wildfire risk, really better understanding our concerns about drought in the future. So we can assess all of these hazards and then through a very collaborative stakeholder process, put together a strategy for how we can reduce our future long-term risk. So that document is up on our website. You can access that. There's also a requirement for local communities to have what's called Local Hazard Mitigation Plans. So those plans are required to be in conformance. They're required to address the same hazards as the state hazard mitigation plan. And there's a whole rubric of FEMA requirements around exactly what those plans need to include. But it's a requirement in order to allow communities to access both hazard mitigation grants, so funding through FEMA, through my program, but also to better understand your risk, to lay out how you might be able to reduce your future risk in your community. And it gives you additional points for the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund program, or ERAF, where the state is incentivizing doing some of these activities. It gives each community more funding when we have a federally declared disaster within public assistance. So getting into the grant program, so I'm going to go through some case studies in a minute, and then I'll give you more details about each of the specific funding programs that we manage. But the quick high level is there's one state program that we currently manage called the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. Most of what we manage is FEMA dollars, but that program allows us to do the things that maybe we can't do with FEMA funding. So it gives us a little more flexibility to meet needs based on Vermont's flooding that maybe don't fit in the perfect FEMA boxes. And then there's 3 FEMA programs that I'll talk about really briefly as well. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, and then Flood Mitigation Assistance. And this program, hazard mitigation, the way we use FEMA funding is a little bit different than some of the other programs. The funding is all managed by my team at Vermont Emergency Management. So communities get support from us, we help develop applications, we review and approve those, and we send those to FEMA for funding, but my team is managing those grants. And generally the types of projects that we're submitting, so this is not an exhaustive list, but this is the majority of what we fund, are starting with property buyouts. So following Tropical Storm Irene until the flooding in 23, this program had completed around 170 total property buyouts across the state. Following the flooding in 23 and 24, we have a list of about 300 potential properties. Those likely won't all go forward, but those are property buyouts that either had flood risk or there's a few in there that had significant landslide risk as well, or were damaged due to landslides following the flooding that we saw in 2023 and 2024. So property buyouts are that example that I gave at the beginning of we're removing a structure, we're maintaining that site as open space so that the risk is no longer there for that property. We also fund floodplain restoration projects. I'll show you a couple examples of what that looks like, but really it's removing fill that's been added over time, lowering our floodplains so that the river has more space when it is high, when rivers are flowing fast. We can also fund infrastructure projects like culvert and bridge upsizing. So if there's a structure that's undersized, that gets plugged, that's creating flooding, we can use funding to put in the full span structure that should be in that location. We've also done a few road resilience or resilience improvement projects to roads, which can include relocating a road. If there's an area that's a little bit safer, we can shift a road and discontinue the existing location. We can fund structural elevation projects, which is lifting a structure up and putting it on a new foundation that gets it out of the special flood hazard area where we tend to see inundation flooding, and flood proofing projects. That could be a municipal building, a business, where we're either preventing water from getting in entirely or setting up a system where we allow water to flow through a building and reduce damage to those structures. We also fund local hazard mitigation plans, predominantly under that Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. We do that every year, and then other scoping and planning activities are eligible as well. So I mentioned a couple of case studies. I want to give you some examples of the sort of things we've done in other communities. Mostly these are projects following Irene. We haven't finished implementing projects following 2023 yet, but we're working on it. So a couple examples that I'd like to share that were highly successful following Irene in Northfields. So one, this is a neighborhood, this Dog River Park is something that is new. So the numbers in black that are shown on the graphic, those are all individual properties that we purchased through the buyout program. So those properties were purchased. It's a voluntary program, so those are people who opted in to participate in the program. It's voluntary to the community opted in to participate in this program, and we were able to remove those structures, and the community was able to then create this beautiful park. So they have this beautiful Dog River Park. There are trails, so you have access to the water. You can actually experience and enjoy the river when it's not in a flood stage. And when it is in flood stage, the water comes up and it can access this park. The park is designed so that it can flood, and it lowers flood elevations in the surrounding neighborhood. So we can see reduced damages to the remaining homes nearby because we've given the river more space in this location. And another project in Northfield that we've been working on for a couple of years is the Crossfeathers Dam removal. So this is just downstream of the neighborhood I just showed you. It's a pretty large structure that's inhibiting the water from flowing in the way that it wants to right before there's a curve in the river. So this is a project that we haven't implemented yet, but we're working on within Northfield to remove all of that structure that's been added and do some floodplain restoration to open up trout habitat to reduce flood risk in this area. And Brattleboro. So I have a couple of floodplain restoration examples that I'd like to show you from Brattleboro, but if you look at this graphic, you can see that blue line winding through is Whetstone Brook. And then Brattleboro over on the right side of the screen downtown, where the river's pretty in size. So we were able to find a couple of areas at Melrose Terrace and at 250 Burge where we could remove fill that had been added over time, give the river a little more space as it curves around before it gets into downtown Brattleboro. So starting with Melrose Terrace, this is a project where in the black on the left you can see those were senior housing units that had been on this site. That's a population that had been evacuated multiple times prior to Irene. We were able to demolish those structures and then put in a giant overflow culvert that you can see on the right to give the river a little bit more space in high flow events. And this is what the project looked like shortly after it was finished, getting everything planted. Again, just like Northfield, this is a much bigger site, but giving the river a little more space, removing the fill that has been added over time. And shortly after this was finished in the summer of 22, there was a December flooding event down in Brattleboro, where you can see from the snow line where the water was. That's as far as the water made it up the site, but none of the remaining buildings on that site were impacted by this event. And you can see from this view, that's just looking at the street level of where that building is and the river coming up to access its floodplain. And the second project, I should have a final picture in here because it was completed this year, but this was another example of a really large site where we were able to remove a significant amount of fill that had been added and again, slow the river down as it's making these curves and winding into downtown Brattleboro. And another example is Brandon. So Brandon is a community that was hit very heavily during Tropical Storm Irene. The water from the Neshobe River normally curves around the community, but in high flow events, rivers don't like to curve. It went straight through downtown and destroyed downtown Brandon. And we were able to, following that event, put in this overflow culvert, which most of the time looks like it does in the bottom right corner. It's vacant, there's nothing there. You can't even see it. If you're walking by on the sidewalk, you don't know it's there. But when the river is high, it can access this culvert to go underneath the community instead of over it. So it was an incredible example of being able to give the water a little more space, and it's been successful many times in preventing flooding within downtown. One more example here in Cambridge is a Cambridge Trail Bridge. So this is a bridge that you can see on the right, a former rail bridge that was significantly undersized with the abutments pushing into the river. We were able to both put in this much larger span structure, but cut out some of that fill that had been added over time. So again, to give the river a little bit more space and slow it down as it's coming into Cambridge and Jeffersonville. So quick overview of the program. So the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, this is funding that follows federally declared disasters in the state. So whenever we have a declared disaster, we get a pot of this funding. Generally, the projects require a 25% match. Depending, sometimes we have state funding available to contribute or to cover that match. And usually what's called a benefit cost analysis is required for most of the infrastructure projects. Often we don't need it for buyouts or elevations. But it's a way to show FEMA that a project is cost effective. And I mentioned local hazard mitigation plans at the beginning. You're required to have a plan in place in order to access this funding. And the best use is really implementing those bigger projects, so doing buyouts, culvert, bridge projects, floodplain restoration, implementation of those larger infrastructure projects. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. So this is an annual funding program. There's typically about $2 million available to each state to use mostly for project scoping activities and for planning activities. That's what we've used it for in the past. And there's a national competition. So there's a significant amount of money available nationally. We can submit to FEMA. Those are reviewed competitively against the rest of the country. We haven't done that often, but we're trying to figure out how to be a little bit more competitive in that space so we can access some of these bigger dollars. And like I said, the scoping studies, this is really a great place to apply for assessments to either look at a full community area, how we can reduce risk, or a specific structure that we know is undersized, get the funding in place to do engineering and upsize that structure. We also apply every year for local hazard mitigation plan updates under this BRIC program. And flood mitigation assistance. So this is also an annual program. All of the funding is nationally competitive. It's specifically for projects that are participating in FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, that reduce risk to that pool. So the federal share depends on the property we're talking about. It could be 75, it could be 100% federally funded. But it's really for those structure projects like buyouts, elevations, and floodproofing of NFIP-insured structures. Or we can do larger community flood reduction projects that reduce risk to many properties that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as the opportunity to do some scoping assessments. And as I said, I'm Stephanie Smith. Please feel free to reach out to dps.hazardmitigation@vermont.gov if you have any questions. You can also visit our website, vem.vermont.gov/funding/mitigation, which will give you any current open funding rounds and their appropriate deadlines. Thank you.